How many of you who are here get excited and look forward to paying your taxes? Raise your hands if you do. Yeah, probably not many, if any. And the letters IRS are letters that don't make us smile. They usually strike fear or dread in our hearts. We don't like the IRS. Although in one church that I served, I did have 2 members of the congregation who worked for the Internal Revenue Service. And I can tell you, they were nice people. They really were. They were kind, generous, very friendly. So they're not all bad. But most of us don't really like them. How many of you are old enough, a few may be old enough to remember as I do, when I was young on Saturday mornings watching Looney Tunes comics? Yeah, a number of you probably did. And there was Porky the Pig and Elmer Fudd, Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Tweety Bird, and Sylvester the Cat. My favorite ones were Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. Absolute favorites, because Wile E. Coyote was always trying to find ways to do the Roadrunner in. He would get dynamite, an unmanned helicopter, a huge anvil that he would try to drop from a large or from a high place. He had portable potholes that he tried to get the Roadrunner trapped in. But it seemed like everything he did, no matter what it was, the Roadrunner would always go zipping right by him before he was ready to do anything, with his nice little sound of beep, beep, and on he went. And it usually turned out, more often than not, that Wile E. Coyote ended up in the trap that he was trying to set for the Roadrunner. Well, thinking about that comic reminded me of today's gospel lesson. Because the Pharisees and the Herodians begin by trying to plot to trap Jesus. And now, these are 2 unlikely groups to have together. Because the Pharisees, the word means separated, apart. They were people who were deeply religious and believed that Scripture was of vital importance, even though they sometimes interpreted it too strictly and messed it up. But they also believed in pure worship and devotion to God, following God's ways as best they could. The Herodians, on the other hand, were more political than religious, and they believed in doing whatever was most expedient for them to accomplish what they desired. And they were quite willing to work with Herod and the government in order to do that. The 2 groups usually didn't like each other. But here, because they have a common enemy, neither of them liking the popularity that Jesus has been gaining, they team up to try to set a trap for him. They begin with some false flattery. We know that you're a person who does what God desires and speaks of God's truth always. But they're not really believing any of that. But that's how they begin. And then they pop their trap question. Does the law allow for paying taxes to Caesar or not? Now, this is clearly a trick question. A lot like the question of, are you still beating your wife? Or, do you continue to tell lies? Are you as dishonest as you used to be? There's no good answers to those questions. They're trick questions. Does the law allow for paying taxes to Caesar or not? In other words, does the Torah, the religious law, allow us to pay taxes to the emperor? This was a very specific tax they're asking about, because the Jews in those days had several different kinds of taxes. They had estate or property taxes, they had customs taxes, they had a temple tax. And by the way, Jesus had just been asked about that one from some other people. Some priests had come to one of his disciples and asked them, does your teacher pay the temple tax? And so the disciple came back to Jesus and said, do we pay the temple tax? Someone was asking about that. And Jesus said, as children of God, we are not required to do that. However, so as not to offend anyone, go down to the waters, cast your nets out, and pull up a fish, open its mouth, and take the coin out of the fish's mouth, and give that to them for payment for you and for me. But this is a totally different tax now that they're asking about. It's the tax to Caesar. It's the imperial tax. The Jews were required to pay a tax to Rome, to their occupiers, their oppressors, in order to help pay for that occupation and oppression. That's the tax that they're asking about. And when they do, Jesus turns the tables on them, asking them to show him a coin. Now, they haven't learned very much, because it had just been a short time before this that the priests had come to Jesus with their question, trying to trap him, asking him, by whose authority are you doing the things that you're doing? And Jesus had replied to them, saying, I'll ask you a question, and if you answer that, then I'll answer your question. John the Baptist, is his baptism from humans, or is it godly? And the priests knew that they had been caught, because they knew that if they said, his baptism is just human, the crowds of people would have been furious with them, because the crowds of people believed that John was from God and that his baptism was godly. And the priests knew that if they answered that John's baptism was godly, then Jesus would simply say, why aren't you following him then? Knowing that they didn't have a good answer for Jesus, they shrugged and said, I don't know. But here, the Pharisees and the disciples that are following the Herodians, they haven't learned anything from that, because they step into Jesus' trap, the trap that they tried to set for him. They step into it as well. Jesus says, show me a coin. And so they bring the coin. And he says, whose image, whose inscription is on this coin? And they say Caesar's. Because on a coin of those days, the head of Caesar would have been prominently displayed, and along with that would be the words, Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus. In other words, to translate it, King Tiberius, son of God. So any faithful, devout Jew carrying a coin like that would be violating the first two commandments. You heard Roy preach on those commandments a couple of weeks ago. And what were the first two commandments? No other gods, no idols. Both of those are on that coin. You notice when Jesus asks for a coin, he doesn't pull one out of his pocket. The disciples don't pull one out of their pockets. One of his questioners has to come up with that coin and show him the idolatrous image. And so Jesus then says to them, give to God, or give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And that makes everything absolutely as clear as mud. What does that mean? What does that tell us? There are some who claim that what this means is that we need to have the separation of church and state, where religion doesn't interfere with politics and politics doesn't interfere with religion. But if that was a message that the Bible was trying to tell us all along, God never would have sent Moses to Pharaoh to tell him to release all of his slave labor and upend the country's economy. So no, I don't think that is what this is about. It's not about separation of church and state. There are some people also who use this text as a proof text to support the payment of taxes or the non-payment of taxes. Or some use it to support saying the Pledge of Allegiance or not saying the Pledge of Allegiance, or serving in the military or not serving in the military, or dozens of other issues of conscience and patriotism and how they combine. But Jesus is not assigning some parts of life to the secular realm and other parts of life to the sacred realm, and never the twain shall meet. Because those two realms constantly intertwine with one another. They are constantly mixed together. So the question for us is, how do we determine in those situations where they come together what's most important? And Jesus doesn't give us any clear answer. He simply leaves it to us to muddle through that and figure it out for ourselves for where our priorities and our loyalties lie. So does the law allow for the payment of taxes? Does the Torah allow that? And Jesus seems to say, at least in part, that it doesn't entirely forbid it. But the more important question for us is not so much whether we pay our taxes or not, but whose image is imprinted on us and on our lives, and how do we let that image live through us? Because what we find in the Bible, at the very beginning, the first chapter of the book of Genesis, is that human beings are created in the image of God. It is God's image that is implanted on us. It's God's image that is engraved on us, meaning that we belong to God. And we have to figure out exactly what that means for the way we live. The question for us is, whose image is on us, and how do we let that image show? In one of the churches that I served in Minnesota, there was a gentleman who was a part of that congregation by the name of Dr. Lowell Guess. And Dr. Guess was a very unusual man. At a young age, he had felt the call to become a medical missionary. And so he went to seminary, graduated from seminary, was ordained, and went to medical school to become a doctor as well, and then went to Africa to serve as a medical missionary. He had been there a number of years, and in his work as a medical missionary, realized that in parts of Africa where he was, there were numerous people who had significant eye problems. Some that he was able to treat, others that were beyond his expertise. And so after a number of years, he decided he would go back to school, become an ophthalmologist, and return to Africa, which he did. He went to Africa, and his wife was a nurse, went with him. And they ended up in Sierra Leone, where they opened what is called the Kissy Eye Clinic. He would work tirelessly, doing surgeries, other ways of treating people who had eye problems. And for every patient that came to see him, before doing any kind of treatments, he would sit down with them and pray with them and for them, and then treat them. Every single patient that came in. By the time I met him, he was nearing retirement age, and for a decade or two, I don't remember exactly how long it had been, he had cut back his time in Africa to 3 months every year and opened an eye clinic in the town where we were living. So he would be there for about 9 months and be in the congregation, and then we would send him off to go back to Africa to work for 3 months. In the months that he was not down there, he recruited other ophthalmologists to volunteer their time and come to serve for a month at a time at the Kissy Eye Clinic. He told me several stories of what went on at the clinic, but one, he became, naturally, from starting the clinic and being there at least 3 months every year, he became very well known. And one year as he went down, he saw a young boy who he had treated the year before and who hadn't been able to see and now could see. And after he saw that boy, he greeted him, and the boy greeted Dr. Guess, who had just arrived, and so the boy turned and started running down the street, calling to everyone who could hear him, "Jesus is here! Jesus is here!" That's how they thought of him. Now, I have never had anyone confuse me with Jesus. For myself, when I think of the image of God, that image in me is certainly tarnished and faded and worn. I don't know about you, but that's how it is for me, trying to see the image of God and display the image of God. And my hope for both myself and for all of you, my hope is that with what we do, with the things that we say, with how we love and the compassion that we show, with the dignity that we demonstrate for ourselves and for everyone else around us, my hope for each of us is that when others see that in us and see us doing that, it will enable people who see us and who know us to say, "I see at least a bit of the image of God in you." In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.